Okay. Thanks a lot, Cameron, and thanks so much, Christy, for that great presentation you had. That was marvelous. Okay, our next speaker is someone that we have heard from already during the seminar, so I won't delay it any longer. So I will give you now talking about the future of environmental health. Please help me welcome Dr. David Dyjack, the Executive Director of the National Environmental Health Association. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan, and I'm trusting everyone can hear me. And are the slides showing properly on everyone's screens?
Yes.
Okay. All right, Dan, do you have control of the slide deck or do I?
I believe you do.
Dr. Dyjack, you should have control. If you have any issues and you want me to take over, just tell me next slide and I'll handle that for you.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed. I'm hitting the page up and page down and I'm not getting a response. So why don't we go ahead and if we want to go back to the first slide, I'll get started. And it's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. I'm calling in from Maryland, so I consider myself either really from the Southeast or an honorary Southeast citizen. It was back on the morning of August the 23rd, just a few weeks ago, I had the impression as I was sleeping that someone was watching me, and it was really creepy. You know what I'm talking about when you're asleep and you get this impression that there's something there. And I got that impression and I woke up and I looked out the window, and the picture you see in front of you is what I saw. This is a blue moon. And the blue moon comes three times a year. It's when a full moon appears 3 or 4 times in one particular season. I should say maybe once or twice a year it appears. But what's really interesting about this blue moon is this was at dawn. It was unreal in its appearance. It was unexpected to me that I would see this moon at dawn, and I ran to get my camera because I was so impressed by it. And frankly, I was taken back because what it gave me was the impression that a new day was being ushered in, one in which the moon was most pronounced first thing in the morning. Next slide, please. And certainly a new day has been ushered in for environmental health, not only in the United States, but in the planet, in my estimation. This summer, 2/3 of all the counties in the United States have experienced some type of extreme weather event. 1/3 of the US population has had some type of weather-related disaster or damage to their homes. At the same time, those of you that are from the governmental public health perspective, and I'm guessing that's most of everyone that's on the line this afternoon, you know what I'm about to say. 20% of your colleagues have resigned, retired, or been removed because of the buffoonery related to COVID-19. This is profoundly disturbing on many fronts. And before I forget, and I'm very likely to do that, thank you. I'd like to thank each and every one of you. And I wish I could do it in person, and I wish I could look you in the eye. I understand what you've been going through for the last 1.5 or 2 years. I've spoken to many of your colleagues and to some of you directly, and I don't know how else to express to you my profound appreciation for all the work that you've been engaged in for the last 2 years relative to COVID. And by the way, that we're still in as we now speak. Next slide, please. It was my profound pleasure last year, or I should say in 2019, to host the Environmental Health Australia annual conference. It was located in Adelaide, but Mrs. D came with me and we spent a weekend in Sydney before we went home. The photo on the left I took is of the Sydney Opera House on November the 10th. And the photo on the right is one I took at the Sydney Opera House on the very next day. Now you might say, oh, that's a blue sky and a cloudy sky. What you see on the right is smoke. The wildfires in Australia burned 46 million acres in the 2019-20 fire season. To give you some perspective, there are 38 million acres in all of Florida. There are 33 million acres in all of Alabama. And so when we think about the breadth and the scope of the impact of these wildfires, brought around by climate change and other issues, the world around us is changing very, very quickly. Next slide, please. Each of us, I believe, needs to get up on the balcony of our minds once a day, once a week, once a month, and ask ourselves, what is going on around us? Because I understand how disruptive the universe has been. How do we cope as a profession? How do we cope as a department? How do we cope as individuals? And I encourage you to get up on the balcony of your mind as we think about the future of environmental health, and for you to remove yourself periodically from the stress, from the confrontation, and from the nonsense that a lot of us are living through. And ask yourself, what is my role in public health? What is my role in environmental health? How do I see myself as part of the societal dance going on around us? And even if you remove COVID, on the best of days, you understand that environmental health, the practice of it, is really complicated. So we do need to remove ourselves and get up on the balcony of our minds and look down at the dance floor. I remember as a young man asking myself at the very first dance I went to, should I be a wallflower? Or do I have the courage to ask Marianne Newman for a slow dance? And for those of you that are my age, I had the courage to ask her to dance and she agreed, and I'll be forever thankful for her. I'd probably still be in recovery if she had declined. And we had a slow dance to this band called Chicago. I don't know if any of you old folks remember Chicago, but they had a really nice slow dance song called Color My World. And we danced that dance and it left an impression on me. And that's what I'm asking you today as we think about the future. Who are you going to dance with at work? And what impression will you leave moving forward? Next slide, please. I don't care what news that you participate in consuming. It could be Fox, CNN, BBC, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, The Economist. The fact is this, and these are facts, that droughts, floods, fires, vector distribution, air quality, infections have gone haywire. And that's not a scientific term, of course, but they have been extreme over the last summer. We've all been affected by it. And those are facts. Next slide, please. There's also another fact I'd like to share with you, that you as practitioners are central players in public health. Don't you ever forget that. This document that you see in front of you, printed in 1993, and I have a copy of it here in my home office, was produced by the National Association of County Health Officials, the precursor to NEHA. And if you ever get a copy of it sometime, I would encourage you to read it, because it describes the core public health functions, assessment, assurance, and policy development. And you know what you'll see in that? Environmental health is profoundly important to the practice of public health. It was almost like an environmental health professional wrote this document. Don't take my word for it. look at it for yourselves. Next slide, please. To be clear, for much of the country, particularly in rural and frontier areas of the United States, environmental health is public health. If you take places, for example, like Texas, or where the NEHA office is in Colorado, you go to a rural or frontier health department, and it's largely staffed by environmental health professionals. Environmental health professionals that are not only doing their work, but they're working on COVID. They're not only doing environmental health, they're working on opioids. And they're working on a variety of other issues not historically related to the environmental health enterprise. The table in front of you was produced by NEHA that describes that after public health nursing, environmental health is the second largest part of the public health workforce. And the people that spend the time in the field, that understand local culture, they understand the local regulatory community, they understand local risks, is you. And you better believe when we talk to influencers in DC, when we talk to influencers at the state level, this is a case we make. This is not our data. This is NEHA's data. And they are making our case for us. Next slide, please. The fact is, environmental health is central to the existence of the planet for the next 50, 100 years or more. This article, written by the engineering community, describes the major challenges the world will face, and take a close look at those. If I had the time, and I don't, 10 of these, all 10, are directly related to environmental health, even including developing and delivering better medicines and securing cyberspace. I don't have the time to go through each one, but you better believe that I could, and make the case that you are central to those enterprises. Next slide, please. In addition to that, the National Intelligence Council, made up of government professionals, made up of the private sector, and made up of academics, have released a report here in the last few months called Global Trends 2040. And if you look at one of the major hypotheses that they present, is that environmental health is profoundly important to the future of the profession. So it's other associations, it's think tanks, and just consider the Middle East right now. Consider the civil war, which I think is wrapping up in Syria. Do you know that the foundational reason that civil war occurred was because of environmental issues? This is not just a capricious conversation. This is central to the health, safety, and security of everybody, everywhere. Next slide, please. And I think you already know this. A disease anywhere is a disease everywhere. Remember Ebola a couple of years ago? Started in West Africa, ended up in Houston, Texas, and other places in the US. As we now speak, 20% of the global pig population has died because of African swine fever. We get asthma that is exacerbated by sub-Saharan sands, which blow over across the Atlantic. And the forest fires of the Western United States are producing smoke and particulate that are affecting Spain and Portugal. This is a global phenomenon. And although I like to say environmental health is profoundly local, we are no longer separate and distinct from anywhere else in the world. Next slide, please. The fact is, this program is being sponsored by the Food and Drug Administration. And did you know that about 1/3 of all food is wasted? And that wasted food that's never eaten produces methane, a lot of methane, frankly, that is 28 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I want you to think about that for a minute. There's as much greenhouse gas produced by wasted food, now listen to this, as automobile transportation. This is not a trivial issue. And as we think about the future, what is your role? What is our role as environmental health professionals? On the right-hand side of the slide, you see a book that I wrote the introduction for. I do not receive any remuneration for this book, by the way, about the environmental impacts of agriculture and nutrition. And I think as we move into the future, we need to think about our role in farm to fork. And how do we promote being a locavore? And how do we promote perhaps eating lower on the food chain? But that conversation I'll save for another day. Next slide, please. What I do know is that the Food and Drug Administration is hosting next month a summit, an e-commerce summit, and I encourage you to attend that. Because the manner in which we consume food, the manner in which we order food is changing dramatically. The single most attended webinar that NEHA has had over the last year was on ghost kitchens. And I know that each and every one of you is struggling with this at the local level. I can't go into a grocery store anymore that doesn't have some type of hotline on it. Now, there's a few of those have tapered back because of COVID, but they'll be back, I promise you. And so the world is changing really quickly. And what does that mean to each of us as practitioners? Next slide, please. As we move into the future, there is something that's really clear. That is, there's truth to the old saying, be a manager and go to jail. Now, I don't say that as a threat. I say it as a fact. The fact is, a peanut butter executive got 28 years in prison because of a salmonella poisoning case. The fact is that Nick Lyons, who was the state health official in Michigan, was indicted for involuntary manslaughter, not because of lead in Flint, but because of Legionella in Flint. And I don't know how that case was resolved, or maybe it's still under litigation, but the world has changed really quickly. Next slide, please. And for those of us in the Southeast, you are not immune to this. I recall 2 years ago, Mississippi, and to my friends in Mississippi, hello. Every state beach on the Gulf of Mexico was closed because of cyanobacter. What do you think that did to the local economy? What do you think that did for local livelihoods? So this is not just a matter of convenience. This is a cold, hard economic truth. That center photo I took, I had the opportunity with my spouse to go to Playa del Carmen. And what you see, and which is in Mexico and the Yucatan, what you see are bulldozers moving sargasso weed off the beach. It was impossible to swim there. There was so much sargasso weed which had come ashore. This is not just a one-off issue. This is a recalcitrant issue. We had a project recently in the Virgin Islands and they had the same issue. We believe it's because of excess nitrogen coming out of the Amazon basin, going out into the Atlantic and the Caribbean, stimulating sargasso weed growth, and then it just ends up getting blown to shore during storms. This has real implications, tens of millions of dollars of implications for the hospitality industry. Next slide, please. We have entered an era, and the irony of me saying this during a food safety conference, we have entered an era where I believe you as professionals are going to be spending a lot more time talking about water and water insecurity than you will focusing on food and food safety. Yeah, you can laugh if you want. I can't see your faces. You can say, ha, 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 that's not possible. Just remember this on the 15th of September. In this country, we waste annually about 2.1 trillion gallons of water through poor infrastructure. Whether or not the Biden's administration's infrastructure bill passes is, to some degree, it's very relevant and somewhat irrelevant because we need to invest $1 trillion to bolster up our water distribution system because it is that poorly constructed. A lot of it, frankly, was installed prior to or around World War II. I want you to think about that. This aging infrastructure and the wasted, treated water associated with that is something that as a country, we're going to have to struggle with. And the question is, what is your role in that as an educator and a promoter of health in your communities? Next slide, please. Water contamination is something that we're all going to struggle with. We are already. I'm in the Chesapeake Bay catchment area. We're already struggling with waste medicines that are showing up in drinking water, showing up in the Chesapeake Bay. There are microplastics which are in fish flesh. The term I hear is festooned. If you analyze fish flesh from many waters adjacent to urban, highly populated urban areas, there's a lot of microplastics in them. There's endocrine disruptors, there's the pharmaceuticals I mentioned. To my colleagues in the Carolinas, you know that you had a Naegleria case, I think it was last year, where a child died from exposure at a water park. There's heavy metal issues which continue to dog us. This includes these lead service lines. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do around not only water sourcing, but the quality of the water. And there's people like me, about 20% of the US population is on well water. I'm one of those, a decentralized service. And folks like us don't get the type of support we need because we're not on central water distribution systems. Next slide, please. Harmful algal blooms in the Southeast profoundly affect the quality of life and the economies of the people that we're trying to serve. In 2018, Sanibel and Captiva Islands off the coast of the Gulf Coast of Florida lost something like $200 million in business in the hospitality industry because of the red tide that was off the shore there. The cost is staggering, not only to wildlife, but to the economies of our local communities. Next slide, please. And then this summer, I don't think I need to tell you, many of you have lived through this, and for you folks in Louisiana and Texas, you know what I'm talking about because you have a storm right now. In North Carolina, there was Fred. In Tennessee, there was flooding. In Louisiana, and I worked once upon a time in the Texas-Louisiana kind of corridor. Every time it floods, there are chemicals that come to the surface that get redistributed. It's not that the flooding is bad enough, it's the chemical contamination that's distributed all around the region. And it affects, again, well water in particular. And homeowner by homeowner has to address that. And so this is a highly complicated environment. And by the way, this is probably going to be the way it is for the rest of your working lifetime. Next slide, please. The Southeast United States is already under tremendous stress from sea level rise. Where I live in Maryland, we're already encountering issues. We encounter issues in Alexandria, Virginia, with flooding during peak tides. The number of days projected to be over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Trends in water availability. For you folks in Atlanta, you know what I'm talking about because you had a pretty severe drought a couple of years ago. And so this feast or famine relative to climate change, by the way, I used to give lectures on this when I was a professor, and I started talking about global warming. No one uses that term anymore, but I did in 1995. And the kinds of things that I was discussing in 1995, the extreme between flooding and drought is occurring all across the United States. I'm not a smart guy. I was just reading a lot. And the trends were pretty clear. And for those of us in the Southeast United States, we need to pay attention to this. Next slide, please. This slide has particular meaning to me. And I first want to draw your attention to this idea that we've only begun to see issues related to fungi, bacteria, and healthcare acquired infections. Did you ever ask yourself, why is our body temperature roughly 98.6? It's not actually 98.6. There's confidence intervals around that. Well, the reason, a part of the reason for that is that fungi don't do very well in the human body when the temperature is over 98.6. This is why you get a fever when you get exposed to an organism. It's your body's way of combating that organism. What we're finding with climate change is that fungi in the environment that would normally be killed off at 98.6 are becoming much more accustomed to warmer temperatures. And clinicians around the world are beginning to see fungal infections that they hadn't seen to date. So this fungi that may be out in the community or maybe out in the environment, which we used to not worry about, we need to start thinking about this stuff, folks. And as we talk about the future, this is a complicated universe. For those of you in the Carolinas, in my home state of Maryland, we have a lot of confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs, you know the term, hog farms and chicken farms, and the antibiotics there that give rise to antibiotic resistance. This is a serious issue. And we see it playing out in long-term care facilities. And as we age in population, it's becoming more and more serious. As I close out this slide, I want you to look at that picture. That is a photo of MRSA. This is what MRSA looks like. Healthcare acquired MRSA. Some poor sap had a minor surgery done on his skin. The skin was sewed up. The poor sap went home, and a couple days later, this infection revealed itself. This individual that is suffering, who suffered from MRSA, and by the way, this photo was taken last month in August of 2021, took good care of that wound. That person washed that wound with disinfectant. That person had their partner take care of that wound. And that person still got MRSA, most likely from the healthcare environment. And that person is me. That is a picture of my skin. I couldn't believe the stuff I've been talking about for years happened to me. And I thought I did everything right. Next slide, please. For those of us in environmental health, particularly in the Southeast, if I hear one more person saying they're retiring in North Carolina, I'm going to go like I'm going to lose it. Florida and North Carolina, it's just not my anecdotal observations. Just look at the data, look at the facts. A lot of baby boomers are moving south to the Sunshine States, and as they move with them, they are going to be like me, getting older. They are going to be much more prone to, because of their resistance changes over time. Their health status changes over time. And the CDC website I took a picture of, people 65 and older are more likely to get sick from germs that animals can carry. What does this mean as the baby boom generation migrates to the Southeast, and they are, what does that mean to your practice of environmental health? What does that mean to pets in restaurants? Ooh, that's a sensitive issue, because your elected officials want to allow pets in restaurants. People love their pets. And what we've seen during COVID is an increase in people that have been prone to getting a dog for comfort, for companionship, and for other reasons. I'm not against pets. What I'm saying is the world is changing around us. It's not static, it's dynamic. Mosquito-borne diseases, we now have Aedes aegypti that stays active over winter in Washington, DC. Let me just be clear. It used to be in DC, the Aedes mosquito would die off. The Zika mosquito would die off. The chikungunya mosquito would die off. Are you with me? And now it's just simply overwintering. Well, what does that mean? That potted plant out in the yard that has that water, maybe I have to assume that there are mosquito larvae breeding at almost any time of year. You want to talk about the future of environmental health? This is part and parcel of that conversation. Next slide, please. Environmental racism seems to be on the front page of most public health publications in the country today. It is true that people of color disproportionately have environmental exposures when compared to other populations. It's simply true. I don't have the time to unpack this in this conversation, but if you look at the impacts of climate change, if you look at Superfund sites, If you look at other issues like hog farms, you will know that it's populations of color that are disproportionately affected. If you really want a great read, there was a UNC Chapel Hill professor called Steve Wing. I never got the chance to meet him, but I would love to have had a conversation with him. And I encourage you to download the article called "Whose Epidemiology, Whose Health?" in which he makes a compelling case on why we should be much more active in ponying up solutions and not just identifying the problems with our data. Next slide, please. Another term that I would like you to Google, and maybe you're an expert on it, some of you, is what's called Waddington's landscape. What this describes is epigenetics. That is how air pollution and contaminants in drinking water and contaminants in seafood and endocrine disruptors in the environment affect our genes that can be passed on to our offspring. There's even a term now that NEHA has called obesogens. Obesogens. And that is, these are chemicals that give rise to obesity in people that are exposed. Today on the planet, there's something like 50 million chemicals in circulation. In the United States, depending on what source you read or believe, somewhere between 35,000 and 80,000 chemicals are floating around in commercial use. Each one by itself may not be an issue, but the synergistic effects of them can affect our genetic material, and we are beginning to see the effects of that in populations all around the country. What is your role in that as an environmental health professional? I know what you're thinking. I'm not paid to work on Waddington's landscape. I'm paid to do other things, but this certainly will be part of our portfolio of work. Next slide, please. Not only is the environment around us changing, but you are changing. You are changing. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see Frank Yanis and you see Steve Red, two stalwarts of the public health community. Steve was the director of OPHPR, the Preparedness group at CDC. Frank Yanis needs no introduction to you. Then there's the distinguished Adam London from Kent County, Michigan. We used to say male, pale, and stale is the leadership of environmental health. Well, it's no longer true. Women and women of color are rising up through the ranks very quickly, and they are leaders in many places already. My charge to you this afternoon is to ask yourself, what does that mean to your office? What does that mean to your workplace? What does that mean to your company? How are we going to create the conditions under which women can be successful? We have a crisis in this country right now. 60% of all college students and university students are female. And those women are much more likely to complete their degrees than men. If you doubt what I'm saying, look it up for yourself. If you look at the accredited environmental health programs over the last few years, what you will see is a steady increase in women enrollments. What does that mean to us? And what does this mean to NEHA? How do we create the conditions under which our female employees can be successful? Next slide, please. And we are not going to escape citizen scientists, and maybe we shouldn't either. Most of you are familiar with Patrick Quaid. I know he's spoken at many FDA meetings, or food safety meetings, I should say. He created this website called iwaspoisoned.com. I'm not supporting it or criticizing it. I'm saying it is a fact, and he is not a scientist. But he felt that governmental public health was not responsive to food poisoning, so he started his own website where individual consumers could report their foodborne illness or what they perceived the source of their foodborne illness. And we all know how complicated that issue is. And then on the right, Olivia Goudreau and her team out of Denver, Colorado, out of their garage created an app where you could report ticks throughout the United States. Olivia has been quite public with sharing that she got Lyme disease. And this is a citizen engaged initiative to embrace the general public around raising awareness of Lyme disease and its spreading presence throughout the United States. It's no longer just in the Northeast. It is distributed in many places. And my question to you is, are you going to embrace these citizen scientists? And I'm asking each of you individually. Are you going to blow them off? Are you going to marginalize them? Or are you going to embrace them? This in of itself is a conversation worthy of dialogue, because they will be present, and they are frankly faster than governmental public health in many cases in releasing information or identifying trends. I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just saying they are nimble. They are not constrained by the same types of guardrails that we have. They don't have the same kind of accountability, so they exist, and we need to understand them, and we need to work with them effectively, whatever that means to you at the local level. Next slide. There are a ton of emerging issues that we could talk about. Tire crumbs. If you don't know about tire crumbs, I encourage you to look it up. These tire shreds are in playgrounds and schoolyards all around the country. There's some pretty good evidence that that's not a good idea. There have been reports of soccer players being at risk of certain types of cancers because of their exposure to tire crumbs on soccer fields. We just heard about cannabis, that great presentation. And you know, that's something each of us, every state right now, it's the wild, wild west, if you will. And then air pollution. And let me be clear, I talked about water being important. Now with COVID, ventilation systems inside of buildings need to get our attention. This is where the action is in many respects. What is the best type of ventilation? How about these portable air cleaning devices? Are they the work of charlatans, or are they effective? And if you get an air cleaning device, how should they be placed and maintained within any particular office space? These are real issues. These are phone calls I get. I have this restaurant. How do I maintain my place of business in a way that protects the health and safety of my employees and the diners? And this is coming at you really quickly. It's already here in many cases. NEHA has been in work from home mode for, gosh, I think we're going on 2 years in March. At some point, we're going to go back to the office. I'm not sure when that is, but this is a question I'm asking myself. How do I meter employees in a way so that there's little risk of breakthrough COVID? Finally, there's great evidence talking about the future that air pollution causes cognitive problems for people. In other words, on a high air pollution day, you shouldn't be taking that test. Let me repeat that. On a high air pollution day, your intellectual performance may be marginalized. Now, the good news for those of us from the Southeast, 24 out of the 25 highest air polluted cities in the country, the urban areas, are in the West Coast and the Midwest. I should say West, mostly in the West. Last month in August, the most polluted city in the world, not in the US, in the world, was Denver, Colorado. More polluted than Bangkok, more polluted than Beijing, more polluted than Nairobi. It's unbelievable. And those folks that were going to school and going to work and trying to function under those conditions may not have been at their best. If you've got a surgery coming, do you really want that physician on that day to be under that kind of condition? Next slide, please. One of the things that we need to struggle with, and listen, I'm struggling with it, maybe it's my job more than yours, is this highly fragmented funding of environmental health in the government sector. I mean, I was so livid earlier this year when I discovered that in a report from the Council of State and Territorial epidemiologists called CSTE. CSTE. They report that 78% of all epidemiologists in the United States are funded by the federal government. I spoke with Scott Becker of APHL a couple of weeks ago, and I had a similar conversation with him about laboratories. Now I have a question mark here because it's not a fact. He was like, Dave, let me get back with you. He thinks about 30% of all labs and lab workers are funded by the federal government. So I tried to dig in and ask, so how does the federal government support environmental health? And I ended up speaking with Betty Beckemeyer. You may know her, University of Washington. She does work on the chart of accounts in public health. She said, Dave, the best evidence we have from maybe 75 regulated 75 health departments where we have data, and that's not a very big number, 75. She said at most it's 14%, but her instincts was that it was 5%. That it was 5%. And I think that 5% largely comes from the FDA, to be blunt with you. And so as we talk about the support for environmental health, we have got to get, and I'm talking to myself really, how do we advocate for sustainable, consistent investments in the governmental enterprise, so that you're not subject to some of the complicated local politics that we've currently experienced over recent history. Next slide, please. What I do want you to understand as we move into the future is that most of us, particularly me, was uniquely not qualified to work in public health when I got my 2 degrees in public health. I knew all about t-tests and p-values and chi-squares and the penetration rate of particles through filters. But no one told me about the principle of reciprocity, the principle of social proof, the principle of unity. These, by the way, come from Robert Cialdini, a PhD, that talks about how to be effective in a social context. And what more data do we need on masks, by the way? We don't need any more stinking data on masks. We know that masks work. Ivermectin, are you kidding me? This is hilarious. We used ivermectin in Africa to control onchocerciasis. Now, maybe the research will come out in the future that says ivermectin is effective against COVID. We'll see. But right now, it's certainly, there's no evidence to support that. Chloroquine use to control COVID, are you kidding me? There's no data to support that. The number of times I've been hammered over climate change, it's like it's not real, it's not this, it's not that. You've all suffered through that. The data's all there. The man-made contributions to this, it's pretty damn clear, but yet we still pretend it like it's a conversation. Pre-COVID-19, I'm talking about pre-COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. Are you kidding me? You know how many lives have been saved by vaccines? Smallpox and the like. I mean, it's incredible. We require these vaccines to go to grade school. Why are we talking about the evidence surrounding the COVID vaccines? And if you go back, I mean, history is just replete with the same kinds of issues, whether it was tobacco or asbestos or lead. What have we learned from that? As historians of public health, we ought to be asking ourselves, what did we learn from the past that might inform the future? Next slide. We need to be much better storytellers, to be blunt with you. I think I'd like to spend the end of my career just on this. What I know is this to be true. When we're talking about our work in environmental health, where we can find an identifiable victim, it is really helpful for people to memorize, for it to stick with them. The stories that we tell with our data have to be relatable to the human beings we're working with. You should read Hillbilly Elegy, right? Just go right to the end, the last several pages, where the author says, you know, unless somebody looks and talks and acts like a local folks are not going to relate to them. They are not going to pay attention to what's perceived as an outsider. You are an insider because you're local. Environmental health is profoundly local. So as we talk about issues related to the environment, whether it's a Naegleria case, someone who's been exposed to MRSA, having a local victim, having somebody everyone recognizes is really important. And something that we're doing at NEHA and we're thinking about is creating a pattern, because people subconsciously, it's what's referred to as the rule of three. When they hear things over and over again from different angles, it begins to sink in. You think just one case, one great presentation is going to change anybody's mind, you're mistaken. And by the way, I'm here with a British reporter named Chris Choi. I'm going to, over the next 9 minutes, wrap up, and I'm going to talk about what NEHA is doing. And then I'll talk about what the profession might consider doing moving into the future. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The slug line means, what should you be paying attention to? Just as an FYI, we do have a new REHS exam. It came out this month. We are doing everything we can to be a simple organization to work with. We are having our aim is to have a single login data backbone where you can work with us to register for our conference, to update your continuing professional education. You can renew your, whatever you want to do with a single login. We're working on that. We have just received word yesterday that a very good experienced talent is joining our staff on October the 1st to help us with a marketing and communications campaign to support local environmental health. We would like to develop tools and resources that you can use to advocate for yourself locally. We're taking this really seriously. What do you need to better communicate the value of environmental health wherever you happen to be? I'm also delighted to report that we received word late last week that we have been given, and I thank the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, $1 million for environmental health internships for the school year 21-22. And we believe that we are going to receive that investment for the next 5 years. This is not NEHA money. This is from the National Center for Environmental Health, and I thank them and I applaud them. We are going to be working with academic institutions across the country to ensure that interns have an opportunity to work with you. And if you want an intern, you will have the opportunity to get one at no cost to you. Please stay tuned with our website. We have a leadership program right now at a very nominal cost for mid-career people. That is underway right now. I think we have 15 to 20 participants. And when I joined NEHA 6 years ago, we had a relationship with 1 or 2 universities. Today, we have research, internship relationships, and relationships around publications with over 24 universities. We feel that the action is in the space between the professions, between the sectors, and this is examples of what we're doing. Next slide, please. We are active on Capitol Hill. We had meetings with 50 elected officials back in the spring. Back when people were meeting face to face, we most recently had a Hill briefing on PFAS. And it was standing room only in the meeting room on Capitol Hill where we had that meeting. On October the 14th, next month, I, along with Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, are doing a national webinar on the Environmental Health Workforce Act. Please look out for announcements for that. I'd be delighted if you would join us for that 1 hour. Brenda Lawrence is a national treasure in my estimation, and she has really been an advocate for us on Capitol Hill. We're also doing everything we can to support you individually, locally, when those opportunities present themselves. Next slide, please. You have heard repeatedly, perhaps ad nauseum, about the flexible funding model grant. Please apply for these resources through the NEHA website. The application period is open. It's open through November the 15th. We've really tried to make it as simple as possible. Please apply for these resources to support your retail food programs. Next slide, please. You also heard us yesterday discuss the collaborative, the Retail Food Safety Regulatory Association collaborative. NEHA is working with NEHA, CDC, AFDO, CFP, and with FDA funding. Thank you, FDA, for supporting this. We're working in a collaborative way to support and touch retail food safety regulators throughout the United States, the US territories, and anywhere else where we can be of assistance. Next slide, please. And then I'm delighted to report that our little animated video, if you haven't seen it, I will share the YouTube link later. We have a video, 2.5-minute video, which demonstrates the value of environmental health to people without science degrees, to elected officials who may be influencers, and then just members of society writ large. It's 2.5 minutes. It is not technical. It is not scientific, but it's intended to pull at your heartstring. And we were selected, if anybody's going to the APHA conference in Denver or signing in wirelessly through the wire, our video was selected as part of the film festival. In addition, the Pan American Health Organization has asked us if we would translate the video into Spanish so that they could use it in Latin America. So we're really pleased with the traction that the video is getting. You are welcome to use it and to repurpose it for your own purposes locally. And if you have any thoughts on the video, if you hate it, tell me. If you like it, tell me. If you've got thoughts about another version of it, please tell me. But it is available right now on YouTube. There is the hyperlink to it on the bottom of the slide, but certainly I could make it a lot easier on you and send it to you directly. Next slide. So now what about the profession? Where's the profession going? Next slide. We are focused, and we will be focusing, let's face it, on emergency preparedness and response and all the dimensions of emergency preparedness and response. And I believe, as I made the case earlier, water is going to be a central feature of that. Too much, not enough, contaminated water, people drowning, which is the way most people are affected during hurricanes and floods. And I think we need to think about ourselves differently. Next slide. We do need to do a better job of telling our own story, not only to the general public, but to our scientific counterparts. NEHA, for its part, has been promoting the environmental health workforce through our own research. And we've had a couple of papers, and we have some great literature out on COVID-19 and how the EH workforce has been affected by that. We got that document into the hands of John Auerbach, who was the White House liaison to CDC. And he actually emailed me back and said, this is really great. I had no idea how much environmental health was involved in COVID. I'm like, well, now you know, sir, please do something with that information. Next slide. I would like to suggest to you that the action is in the space between the professions. By the year 2050, 70% of Americans will live in big cities. For those of you that can operate in rural areas as well as big cities, I think you're going to find yourself in high demand. For those of you that are conversant and can work effectively with engineers, with clinicians, with people in planning, and with architects, you're going to find yourself in high demand. For those of you that speak a second language, Spanish in particular, you're going to find yourself in high demand. What we accomplish in the future will be largely focused on not what we do within the profession, but what we do with other professions. Next slide, please. Character matters in the post-truth era. Please understand that 93% of what someone thinks of you has nothing to do with your data. I'm sorry. It has to do with your body language, your tone of voice, how you present your content. And then for NEHA's part, we believe in intellectual honesty. If for those of you that attended our conference this last year, the 3-part virtual program, our very first major political conversation invited Republicans and Democrats. Everybody is welcome at NEHA, independent of your political leaning, and I consider that intellectual honesty. Next slide. We need to see ourselves as meta leaders. We have the unique ability to describe and to prescribe what our local citizens need to compress morbidity. We ought to look at ourselves as hotbeds of innovation. I've tried to lead NEHA in that direction because our backgrounds, our natural science backgrounds are uniquely suited to be effective in the work that we do. Most Fortune 1000 CEOs have liberal arts degrees. And so for many of us like me, I have a BS degree in biology from a liberal arts school. It provides us the foundation to be effective, but we do need to be unpretentious. We do need to be collaborative, and we do need to find ourselves taking risks, measured risks, or to find ourselves in a place where we can do that. Next slide. Leadership is evolving, and I think we should evolve with it. It used to be Theory X management, right? The big, strong person in the front giving the directions. And then we began to admire the Bill Gates, the smart guys. Well, now I think we're in a new era, and environmental health professionals should embrace that, where we lead with heart, where we're empathetic, where we learn and we listen very well. And man, I could spend an hour just on this slide, but let's go ahead and wrap up. I have 3 slides left, and we will be complete here in just a couple of minutes. The roses for us, as we look at the future, is that we're credentialed. We have local expertise. We're the backbone of the public health system, and most of us are well educated. Where we really struggle is with that service fragmentation that I described, and we need NEHAs taking this seriously. We suffer from the plight of the ordinary. The great work that we do often gets overlooked because we do it every day. And the question is how do we tell stories to get us from ordinary to extraordinary? And then our obsession with data is going to kill us, in my estimation. I mean that tongue in cheek. I have made the case in this presentation that data only gets us so far. But yet what I hear from my friends at the federal level is data, data, data. Yes, we need good data, but we also need to do something with it and to be effective in the social environment. Next slide. I've made the case over the last 45 minutes that we need to be effective storytellers, that we need to be effective locally, because that's where the action is. Climate and health is going to dominate the future. Concurrent disasters, that is floods and COVID, hurricanes and COVID, sound familiar, folks? Lyme disease and COVID, Zika and COVID, you name it. There's always, let's say, forest fires and air pollution. There you go, concurrent disasters. That is going to dominate the profession. And how do you operate in that? The retired community, how do we work with them? And then I'm going to make a case for you today that we need a national pandemic czar in the United States of America. It is time for that. And frankly, I think it should be an environmental health professional. My last slide relates to, and I hope you'll follow me for this last minute, and that is relates to lessons from the wetlands. I don't know if that next slide will pull up. And I have these pictures of spadefoot toads. These toads live, at least in my example, live on the eastern side of the Sierras. They sing in unison in the vernal swamps that align the mountains there in the eastern side of California. And recently, the US government decided to have the military fly their planes over those swamps. And as the frogs were singing in unison to sing out to potential mates, a jet would fly over and disrupt the singing. So one lone toad or one lone frog would begin to sing. And because he was singing by himself, he got picked off by a coyote or an owl. And each time the planes would fly over, the process would repeat itself. And so instead of the frogs singing in unity, they got picked off one by the disruption around them. There's a lesson there for us, I believe. It is time for us to sing in unison. If one of us gets picked off at the local level, all of us are harmed. And for NEHA's part, we would like to assist all of us into singing together. We don't have to agree on everything, but let's sing about how this profession is the backbone of society, is the backbone of public health. And it supports the health, safety, and economic security of everyone in this great land. thank you for all you're doing with COVID. And if there's any questions, I would be happy to entertain those right now.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Dyjack, for that, for your presentation. You know, I've heard you several times now, and I've got to say, every time I've heard you, I've always found you interesting and thought-provoking and inspiring. So I appreciate very much what you had to say here and you addressing this group. We do have one question in the chat. Let's see if I can find it again after I kind of lost it. But the question came back, and what I'll do is I'll ask you maybe to give just a very quick, maybe couple of bullet points or down and dirties for us to take away with this. The question was, what do you see as the role of environmental health, and I assume as specialists too, environmental health specialists, in climate change? Many of my colleagues are not sure of what our role really is in this issue. So if you just give a couple of good bullet points to take away.
Sure, I understand that complexity. I think first, there needs to be foundational support for environmental health to be part of the climate change conversation in the country. What you can do until that time is to normalize climate change in your own environment, to tell stories about it, you know, using somebody that, or using conditions that affect each of us. Now in the Southeast, that's really easy with these storms. You don't even have to say this has become because of climate change, but you can use it as an illustration. This flooding seems to be getting worse. Let's talk about what you think that might, what might be behind that. What effects is that having on the health and safety of our local community, on the value of your property, on the damage that has occurred. And so take those teachable moments, number one, and try to teach, but don't lecture, right? Within the cultural context, within the conditions of the local community, start where people are at and personalize it. And then as funding opportunities, number two, as funding opportunities come up, and I think that they will over the next several years, try to encourage your health department to apply for those funding opportunities. It's with those resources, additional resources, that you might be able to hire an FTE or to buy out somebody's time to begin to work on this in earnest. So those would be two things: normalize the conversation locally, and where there are opportunities to get resources, and I think that there will be, to try and encourage your leadership or encourage yourself to apply for those.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think we've kind of used up our time now, so I'll probably end it. There may be a few more questions on there. So Dr. Dyjack, if you wish to stay on and view some of the chat and answer some of the questions you run across there, you're more than welcome to do so. What we're going to do, oh, go ahead.
Thank you. I was just going to say, this presentation is available to everyone, correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
Okay, so I saw one question: how do I get a copy of the PowerPoints? I think from this program, if you can't get it, just email me directly. My email address is on the NEHA website, and I'll send it to you directly.
Great, thank you very much.